Little Fox.
Thumbelina, Chapter 1. A Very Special Gift. A long time ago, there lived a kind woman. She loved to keep busy in the garden. Her name was Mrs. Marigold, and she lived a simple life. She had only one wish.
I wish I had a child,
she sighed. One morning, she awoke very early. She looked out her window and noticed something strange.
Why are my flowers moving like that?
She said. She went outside to have a better look.
Oh my, what is this?
She gasped. A tiny woman with a basket stood among the daisies. She had bright red cheeks and small wings. Suddenly, she looked up and saw Mrs. Marigold staring down at her.
"Don't step on me!"
she shouted in a high voice.
"I'm not a bug!"
Are you a fairy?
asked Mrs. Marigold.
"Of course!
She replied, pointing to her wings.
I'm a garden fairy!"
What are you doing here?
She asked.
"I'm helping you with your garden,
The fairy said.
but I'm leaving now. I've stayed too long already."
Wait, may I make a wish?
Mrs. Marigold asked excitedly. The fairy rolled her eyes.
"I'm not a genie!"
She snapped. Then the fairy noticed Mrs. Marigold's sad face.
"All right, I'll see what I can do. But you must promise not to tell anyone about me."
Mrs. Marigold agreed and then said,
I want a child.
The fairy thought a moment. Then she took something out of her basket.
"This is a special seed.
She explained.
Plant it in a pot. Put the pot in the window. Don't water it. It just needs lots of sunshine. Wait a few days."
Mrs. Marigold stared at the seed. She looked up and asked,
Then what?
but the fairy was gone. Mrs. Marigold took the seed inside and did exactly as she was told. The seed grew very fast. Soon it became a red tulip bud. On the third morning, Mrs. Marigold noticed the tulip bud moving.
Something is happening.
She said quietly. Mrs. Marigold bent down and kissed the bud. At that moment, the petals opened one by one. Amazed, Mrs. Marigold stared at the flower.
At last, my wish has come true.
She cried. Inside the flower was a tiny girl. Her hair was the color of sunshine. Her eyes were blue like the sea.
Where am I?
Said the girl. She had the loveliest voice.
You are home.
Said Mrs. Marigold.
I am your mother.
Mrs. Marigold held out her hand. The little girl jumped into her palm.
Hello, Mother.
Said the little girl.
What's my name?
The girl was only the size of Mrs. Marigold's thumb. wiping a tear from her eye. Mrs. Marigold said,
Your name is Thumbelina.
Thumbelina, Chapter 2, Thumbelina's New Home. Mrs. Marigold took very good care of Thumbelina.
You are tiny, so I must keep my eye on you,
said Mrs. Marigold. Every morning she took Thumbelina into the garden. Thumbelina liked to sit next to her mother.
Give me a rose seed, dear,
Mrs. Marigold said one day.
I'm strong, Mother.
Thumbelina replied.
I can pass you 3.
Gardening took much longer with her daughter helping, but Mrs. Marigold didn't care. She was happy to have Thumbelina. Her daughter also liked to help Mrs. Marigold cook.
Thumbelina, pass me the salt,
Mrs. Marigold said one day as she made dinner.
This salt shaker is heavy,
Gasped Thumbelina.
but I can do it.
Thumbelina pushed the salt shaker to Mrs. Marigold. On hot days, Thumbelina loved playing in the water. One afternoon, Mrs. Marigold filled a bowl with water. Then she set the bowl on the windowsill. Soon, Thumbelina was floating in an acorn shell, singing happily. A toad was hopping along outside, and it stopped under Mrs. Marigold's open window.
What's that beautiful sound?
The toad, Mrs. Burp, said to herself.
It's coming from that window.
So Mrs. Burp jumped onto a flower box under the window. She peeked around a flower and looked up.
Why, it's a tiny girl with an angel's voice,
said the toad.
She's very pretty too.
Mrs. Burp returned to the flower box many times. She wanted Thumbelina to marry her son. Thumbelina's bed was half a walnut shell. Every night, Mrs. Marigold filled the shell with flower petals for Thumbelina's blanket.
What kind of blanket would you like tonight, dear?
Mrs. Marigold always asked.
Tulips, please.
Thumbelina always replied.
They're my favorite.
One night, Thumbelina asked,
Mother, may I sleep near the window tonight?
Why, my sweet daughter?
said her mother.
I want to see the stars.
Of course,
replied Mrs. Marigold. She put Thumbelina's bed on the sill of the open window.
You make me so happy, darling.
Her mother said as she tucked her in.
Good night.
Mother, you make me happy too.
said Thumbelina.
Good night.
Mrs. Burp was hiding in the flower box. She waited until the lights went out.
Ha! Now's my chance.
Croaked Mrs. Burp. She jumped onto the windowsill, grabbed Thumbelina, and jumped out again.
Mother! Mother!
Cried Thumbelina. But it was too late. Thumbelina, Chapter 3. In the Swamp with the Burps. Mrs. Burp lived in an old, smelly swamp. She took Thumbelina to a lily pad in a stream nearby.
This is your new home,
Said the toad.
I don't like it here.
Said Thumbelina.
Well, too bad.
Said Mrs. Burp.
You're not going anywhere.
Mrs. Burp disappeared into the darkness. Thumbelina was scared. Water was all around her, and there was no way to escape.
I miss my mother.
She whispered, then cried herself to sleep. The next morning, Mrs. Burp was up early. She woke up her son.
Croaky, let's go meet your bride.
She said excitedly.
Be on your best behavior.
Croaky blinked slowly.
Okay, Mama.
Thumbelina was just waking up.
What a terrible dream.
She said. Then she opened her eyes. The two toads were staring at her. Thumbelina stared back. Croaky was even bigger than his mother.
It wasn't a dream.
The tiny girl said sadly.
This is Croaky, your future husband.
Mrs. Burp said to her.
She's pretty, Mama.
Croaky said. Suddenly, his eyes moved. A small fly flew by. Croaky quickly stuck out a sticky tongue and ate the fly.
Ugh.
Said Thumbelina.
Now, get to know each other.
Said Mrs. Burp.
I'll be getting ready for your wedding.
She hopped away.
Please take me home.
Begged Thumbelina. Croaky shook his head.
Mama will be angry. And you don't want to make Mama angry.
But I don't want to marry you.
Said Thumbelina. Croaky let out a loud burp. The sound made Thumbelina hate him more.
I'll make a great husband. I can catch any kind of bug.
He boasted.
I'll show you.
Just then, a beautiful butterfly flew by.
Watch me.
Croaky jumped into the water, splashing Thumbelina. He jumped from lily pad to lily pad, chasing the butterfly. Thumbelina had to do something.
Croaky,
She yelled loudly.
leave that butterfly alone, you big bully.
Croaky stopped and burst into tears.
I'm going to tell Mama what you said.
He yelled and hopped away. Thumbelina watched the butterfly fly away safely.
I've got to escape too.
She cried.
Maybe we can help,
a voice said.
Who said that?
Thumbelina looked around. She saw no one.
Down here,
said the voice. Thumbelina looked down at the water. She saw a school of fish. One of them was looking right at her.
Croaky thinks it's fun to scare others,
said the fish.
I can see that,
said Thumbelina.
Don't worry,
said the fish.
We'll help you escape.
Thumbelina, Chapter 4. Escape from the Swamp.
The stem of this lily pad is underwater,
said the fish.
We'll chew through it. The lily pad will float away and you can escape.
All the fish dived below and began chewing. Thumbelina heard the toads coming back.
No one is going to call my son names.
Mrs. Burp yelled.
Come on, Croaky!
I'm coming, Mama!
Croaky shouted behind her.
Please hurry.
Thumbelina said to the fish. The toads got closer. Suddenly, the lily pad began to float away.
Look!
Yelled Mrs. Burp.
She's getting away!
Come back here!
Croaky shouted at Thumbelina.
We must do something,
the fish said to each other. Suddenly, Croaky began to giggle.
Hey, stop that!
He laughed. The fish had surrounded the burps and started to tickle them with their fins.
Go away!
Laughed Mrs. Burp. But the fish kept tickling. Thumbelina's lily pad floated down the stream.
Thank you, my fish friends.
Thumbelina called. She enjoyed the sights around her as the lily pad moved faster.
I'm so glad to be free.
Thumbelina said.
Look at all the trees and flowers.
Then Thumbelina's lily pad suddenly stopped.
Oh no, I'm stuck on a rock.
She cried.
Now what am I going to do?
A bird above her began to sing, and Thumbelina looked up.
I wish I had wings like that bird. I could fly off this lily pad.
The bird had bright blue feathers and a beautiful voice.
What are you doing here?
Asked the bird.
It's a long story. Anyway, I'm stuck.
I'll help you.
The bird said.
Where are you going?
Thumbelina paused and then answered.
To see the world.
I'm Pete.
Said the bird.
Can I go with you?
I'm Thumbelina.
She said happily.
And I'd love you to come with me.
Pete looked for a way to help her. Then he flew away. A few seconds later, he came back with a long piece of string.
Tie this to the lily pad.
He said. Thumbelina did so.
And tie the other end to my leg.
Now what?
She said.
Hang on, Thumbelina.
Pete took off into the air. The lily pad became a flying carpet. It lifted Thumbelina just above the water.
Pete, I'm flying!
She shouted.
This is so much fun!
She laughed as her hair blew in the wind. Thumbelina looked at the fish in the water. They waved goodbye with their fins.
We're off to see the world!
Her new friend called out. Thumbelina closed her eyes. The wind felt cool against her cheek.
I feel so free.
She cried. Then, suddenly, something grabbed Thumbelina.